Great. So everybody can hear me? Yeah. So hi everyone. So we'll start. I'm Jonas-Sébastien Beaudry. I'm an assistant professor co-appointed in law and at the IHSP at McGill, and I convene the Disability Working Group. It's my great pleasure to be taking part to a panel with Eva Kittay, Distinguished Professor of Philosophy from Stony, Brook, and SUNY, and with Jennifer Nedelsky, Professor at Osgoode Law School. We'll be discussing how justice theories can fall short of accommodating the caring needs of everyone, especially people with disabilities, and how justice and care needs could be conceptualized differently. So I'll begin right away myself by suggesting how some aspects of the status quo can get in the way by talking about the social contract. So I will share my screen with you. So if my screen is not visible, Anaik, you can let me know. Okay. So I will present what social contract theories are, why they are appealing and ubiquitous in our political ethos, and why they make it difficult to fully integrate people with severe intellectual disabilities in our society. Social contract theories predicate the authority of rules that govern society on the idea that these rules are the product of a contractual agreement struck between members of society. These theories take for granted that parties to such agreements possess certain characteristics, making certain kinds of contracting possible. For instance, prudence, mutual disinterest, or rationality. They also assume the moral, political, or strategic importance of certain contractual features, for instance, equality and reciprocity between contractors. Social contract theories employ a normative or descriptive narrative about the origins of society, presenting parties to the social contract as endorsing certain rules and principles when they set up basic social institutions. Contractual procedures may also be used to assess the morality of smaller scale interactions. For instance, a personal relationship that is not mutually beneficial may be deemed to be morally problematic from a contractual perspective. This theory is a venerable philosophical tradition dating back to ancient thought. However, social contract theory is best characterized as modern. It shares the Enlightenment's ideal of relying on reason rather than on an order antecedent and given to us, such as scriptures, to justify and delineate our moral and political obligations. Rather than a fixed set of moral norms, the social contract is an intellectual procedure through which contractors can reach an agreement on such moral content. Social contract theory has been usefully divided in two variants, contractarianism and contractualism. Contractarianism lays out a prudential approach to morality and politics, according to which people are self-interested bargainers who see an advantage in negotiating mutually beneficial terms of coexistence with other citizens, since others can both harm them and benefit them. Contractarianism extends the ordinary tit-for-tat logic of contracts to an entire society which would design state apparatuses to ensure that everyone compromises and benefits from social arrangements. Contractualist theories, by contrast, focus on honoring personal autonomy. They rationalize authority by setting up social institutions and imposing norms that are reasonable and justifiable to the parties bound by them, thus respecting citizens' capacity to self-legislate. Both strands of the social contract tradition are appealing precisely because they rely on widely shared individual traits that also happen to be important values of the liberal ethos, namely rationality, reasonability, prudence, self-interest, autonomy, as well as shared intuitions that fair social arrangements require reciprocity and impartiality. These values and intuitions permeate our political culture, rules of governance, laws, and other social institutions such as healthcare and education. If contractual intuitions are indeed structuring our social and political arrangements, we have cause for concern if they fail in important ways. Notably, contractual thought may not suffice in making moral and political sense of the whole human experience, and the ideals it conveys may even insidiously become a palatable ideological veneer for oppressive social structures. For instance, some have criticized social contract theories for neglecting injustice within the institutions of the family, as well as the unequal treatment of people, mostly women, caring for dependents in and out of the family. Liberal approaches, beginning with the fiction of a nation as an association of free and independent equals, as Eva Kittay writes, seem to forget that vulnerability and dependency are universal characteristics of human beings to which society must respond in a socially fair way. By contrast, an ethics of care would suggest that properly responding to human vulnerability and interdependency is a more compelling ethical foundation for moral and political theories, as opposed to ideals of reciprocity between independent bargainers. So, the neutral language used to describe the subject in contractual theories may conceal differences that justice ought to take into account. In doing so, social contract theories may condone relations of exploitation and domination, such as patriarchy and white supremacy. The social contract tradition is especially problematic for people with severe intellectual disabilities, who may actually lack the capacities that enable someone to be a contractor. From a contractarian, scratch my back, I'll scratch yours perspective, people with severe intellectual disabilities do not seem to be a threat, and collaborating with them does not seem to be beneficial from a self-concerned and mutually disinterested point of view. From a contractualist perspective, they seem to lack the cognitive capacities required to be rational, reasonable, and autonomous. From both these contractual perspectives, people with severe intellectual disabilities may well be the object of care or charity, but would fall short of being full moral and political subjects with whom it's advantageous to negotiate or who imperatively deserve respect, if respect is understood as a kind of deference towards people's capacity to formulate and pursue a conception of the good life. People unable to reciprocate, cooperate, or devise a conception of the good life may not even be persons in this cooperative political sense, nor in the moral sense of being able to exercise freedom. While it is possible to stretch the meaning of mutually beneficial relations, some contractual thinkers, therefore, admit that people with severe intellectual disabilities fall beyond the realm of justice, if not morality, altogether. But some other innovative contractual thinkers have put forward a variety of arguments to ensure that people with disabilities are protected within social contract theories. I review these strategies, their merits and limitations, in my forthcoming monograph called The Disabled Contract. I suggest that these integrationist arguments partially fail, but their shortcomings teach us about the nature of a disabled contract, that is, the ableist ideology underlying contractual thought that parties to the contract are trained to not even detect. The most obvious contractarian argument of that kind to bring people with severe intellectual disabilities into our political community is by showing that it is advantageous for other members of the community to include them. For instance, following the social model of disability's key insight that disability is socially constructed, one could argue that people with severe intellectual disabilities are merely unprofitable contractors because of current social arrangements that prevent them from being productive and cooperative. After all, many organizations offer vocational activities and training to people with intellectual disabilities. However, if profitability is to be the guiding principle, rather than ensuring that people with intellectual disabilities, say, have a flourishing life, some disabled people would still not be profitable enough to cooperate with. We might then point to other ways of contributing to society than through traditional work. For instance, we could say that people with severe intellectual disabilities help to create jobs, such as caretaking professions. Second, we could say that vulnerable people help their community to develop more comprehensive caring that will benefit all members of the community, as they may all become dependent upon such institutions at some point in their lives. Third, we could say that that the vulnerability of people with severe intellectual disabilities and other people with profound disabilities teaches us about our own vulnerability, which could be seen as a kind of profitable insight. However, all of these suggestions assume what needs to be proven. The first argument assumes that we ought to subsidize care work for people with severe disabilities rather than considering the bleak alternative of not doing so, or of letting the costs of such caretaking be assumed by those who are personally attached to them. It may also subtly assume that developing a caring self is a more valuable objective than pursuing other preferences or conceptions of the good life. At worst, it treats severely disabled people just like any other source of work, implying that care work for them could be replaced by another kind of work or industry that would achieve similar social results. The two other arguments on the slide also offer a problematically derivative or contingent status to people with severe intellectual disabilities, or else smuggle some moral pools into it that don't quite fit a contractarian framework founded on self-interest. This is not to say it's not good, but just that it doesn't fit a contractarian framework. Leslie Francis and Anita Silvers take another tack. They insist on abandoning the misleading metaphor of the social contract as a tit-for-tat exchange. Instead, they argue that society is more accurately conceived of as a complex net of transactions that fundamentally requires a climate of trust in which any being able to trust or be trustworthy can participate. People with severe intellectual disabilities' contribution to fostering a climate of trust can be said to occur not in spite of their disability, but because of it. However, trust is a complex phenomenon with cognitive, affective, cognitive dimensions and can give rise to different meanings. For instance, I trust that a purse would be taken if I left it on the platform of a busy metro station because I trust in the predictability of people's untrustworthiness. Silvers and Francis use the concept of trust in two different contexts, whereby trust could be reasonably expected to imply different features. The trust that members of a society want to foster in order for cooperative endeavors to take place, and the trust that people with intellectual disabilities can give or receive. It's essential that these two notions overlap or are connected in some causal way if Silvers and Francis' argument is to succeed, since they argue that fostering the latter kind of trust is desirable because fostering the former kind of trust, that enhance social cooperation, is desirable. The kind of trust necessary to stabilize social cooperation may have attitudinal or behavioral elements that are different from the ones taking place in relations with people with severe disabilities. For instance, if trust is taken to mean an expectation that people will behave a certain way, all that should be needed to secure stable cooperation would be inductive confidence in the ability to predict someone's behavior. This would be different from an understanding of trust of the kind that someone has towards her caregiver, namely that the caregiver has her best interests at heart. Certain understandings of trust may have other regarding or personal features that may not be required to instill trust in a social climate. One could still insist that a trust-infused society would benefit from a more other-regarding understanding of trust. However, we may then wonder if the reasons for interpreting the social contract tradition through this lens are necessarily or even best expressed through contractual thought. Contractualist thinkers have also put forward various strategies to conceptualize people with severe intellectual impairments as active participants of the social contracts. These strategies all attempt to normalize people with intellectual impairments by modifying the benchmark requirements for counting as a contractor, or by arguing that they do meet these requirements despite appearances to the contrary. These integrationist strategies are extremely meritorious. I don't have the time to review each of them now, but I suggest that they appear to share an unspoken moral background. Accommodating or supportive social measures seem warranted on the basis that people with severe intellectual disabilities already belong to our society and are entitled to equal consideration. This implied or assumed membership seems to be grounded in a kind of concern for people with severe intellectual disabilities, which cannot be explained on contractual terms, If we analyze contractualist and contractarian strategies without taking this concern into account, they begin to look like conceptual stretches or dubious empirical wagers. No matter how severe a person's disability, revisionist contractualist authors seem to assume that we must give her some concern as a person, that is, as a member of our society to whom robust duties are owed. In that sense, contractualists and contractarian thinkers may find it natural to frame people with severe intellectual disabilities not only as persons, but also as contractors. Otherwise, they must concede that the normative concept of person is not exhausted by that of contractor. Doing so without abandoning a contractual stance is part of the next integrationist strategy I will present to you, which is that if people with severe intellectual disabilities cannot be active contractors, the next best thing integrationist contractual thinkers can do is to argue that one need not be a contractor to benefit from the social contract. It's not as obvious as it seems, as parties to and beneficiaries of the social contract are often conflated. Under the contractualist/Kantian tradition, the conflation is best understood by considering Kant's theory that only moral agents are owed non-derivative respect. Only respecters need be respected. A similar idea is found in Rawls' theory of justice when he says that only those able to give justice are owed justice. The basic contractualist idea behind this conflation is that only rational autonomous selves are worthy of respect. Respect of autonomy is so central to this interpretation of the contractualist tradition that nothing else warrants granting a strong moral status when we think in terms of the status that members of a moral and political community have. Nonetheless, there are a few strategies to secure the status of severely intellectual disabled people within a community in more indirect ways. The most promising of these arguments assimilate them to full contractors. In other words, people with severe intellectual disabilities do not have what it takes to participate in traditional versions of the social contract as active subjects, but they are meaningfully similar enough to active subjects so as to share their moral and political status. A common version of this argument would ground moral status in the fact that a being belongs to a kind or a genus, such as the human species, whose members normally develop capacities that meet contractual expectations. However, this variant of human exceptionalism does not clearly belong to the social contract tradition, which makes use of specific cognitive capacities to justify personhood rather than mere humanity. Other integrationist arguments for the passive inclusion of people with disabilities on the contractualist side have been offered within the Rawlsian framework. The most obvious argument would be to extend Rawls's veil of ignorance so that contractors would not know whether they might themselves be disabled and may therefore want to make provisions for the benefit of people with severe intellectual disability. However, on a Rawlsian account, the veil is justified because it expresses the moral claim that certain facts about people should not matter when setting up a system of distributive justice, their skin color or religion, for instance. While parties behind the veil can make provisions for the worst that could happen to the people they represent, they are limited by these parameters. That is, what could happen precisely to the people they represent. These represented people are defined as fully cooperating throughout a lifetime, which excludes people so severely disabled that they may not cooperate in such a way, such as people with severe intellectual disabilities. To circumvent this constraint without abandoning Rawlsian commitments to contractualist ideals is no small challenge, considering that the main idea behind justice as fairness is to secure conditions for a mutually advantageous cooperative venture, to quote Rawls. Most theorists tinkering with or interpreting a Rawlsian framework to integrate people with severe intellectual disabilities assume some kind of bond between traditional contractors and their fellow people with severe intellectual disabilities. These attempts to explain the robust moral status that people with severe intellectual disabilities have as passive citizens of our communities not only ultimately rely on non-Rawlsian or non-contractualist values, they also risk being too indeterminate or not sufficiently fleshed out to provide people with disabilities with the care they actually need. This is partly because their needs risk being assimilated to the needs of non-disabled contractors. Contractarian arguments to integrate people with severe intellectual disabilities in our community do not fare better. People with disabilities could be given some guest or honorary status within our community, depending on what those who loves them demand from their society. This would make their status rather contingent, and it also reduces their worth to being a contractor's preference rather than an independent source of moral and political obligation. So I have briefly surveyed some strategies that social contract theorists could adopt to either include people with severe intellectual disabilities specifically and people with disabilities more generally in the category of full subjects of justice, or to confer a robust moral status upon them, as listed on the slide. However, so these strategies have two main shortcomings. First, they cannot convincingly ground a robust moral status for people with severe intellectual disabilities. Second, they attempt to do so at the cost of making that status merely derivative or contingent. Moreover, their integrationist drive or assimilationist drive points to an unspoken foundation which may be profitably developed using non-contractual arguments and ideals, such as caring, concern, hospitality, or a variant of human exceptionalism, which do not clearly belong to contractual thought. These conclusions made me suggest that we need to complement contractual thinking with some other ethical and political approaches. However, I will leave it to my co-presenters to discuss where we should go next. My own presentation aimed at suggesting that the continuing shortcomings of the social contract tradition, to cite Raymond Goers, is not in an easily fixable tiny mole that serves as a beauty spot, as he writes, to set off the radiance of the rest of the face, but the epidermal sign of a lethal tumor. So I will stop sharing my screen and pass it on to Eva Kittay. You need to unmute yourself.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm going to need to share my screen. Is my screen shared? Jonas?
Not yet.
Okay. Okay, now it's shared, right?
I didn't see it appear yet. Is it on the green button under your camera?
I'm sorry.
Share screen?
All right, there we go. Okay.
Perfect. Yes, thank you.
So Jonas has done a magnificent job of actually priming the audience for my conception here and for my talk. In a second, I need to get this to work. I apologize. I had it all set up, but it changed. Okay, there we go. Jonas has argued, I think definitively, that there's no form of social contract that is fully inclusive of all human beings, regardless of race, gender, sexuality, age, and disability. He argues that the only way some theories manage to include significantly cognitively disabled people is by moving away from the basic elements of contract theory, or by only including some people with lesser forms of cognitive disability. If we want to get to a theory that includes these individuals, the contract theory may not be a promising start. We have we can't get, if we have a New Englander saying, if I was aiming to get there, I wouldn't start from here. We have two choices. One is that we could abandon the quest, arguing that hard cases make bad law, or in this case, bad theory. Beaudry suggests that we abandon justice theory as a way to deal with these cases and look for values other than justice for how to treat this group well. Or we can insist on the need for justice and try to find another way to get from here to there. So why drop the here of political philosophy? Well, for one, Jonas and I have a vested interest in the fate of people with cognitive disabilities. And I don't want to endorse theories that leave to the side people who occupy a central place in my concerns. The small group of congenitally severely disabled people becomes enlarged. That is my daughter there, becomes enlarged when we think of late onset cognitive disabilities, such as dementia. And we need to think, ought we not, for anyone at any time may incur injuries that are so severe that they resemble the disabilities of those of my daughter Sesha, who you see here. Yes, that's Carnegie Hall she was visiting. She loves music. She has very significant cognitive and physical disabilities. Furthermore, accommodating just people with mobility disabilities by creating curb cuts has allowed for greater mobility for so many other than those who use wheelchairs. So finding a theory of justice that includes people with very significant cognitive disabilities may actually give us a better way to think about just social arrangements. Joshua Cohn, the philosopher, a political philosopher, puts forward what he calls the notion of a democratic social ethos, that the way we live together, the social arrangements in democratic society of free and equal people should leave no one less well off than anyone needs to be, and that each is treated with respect, that is, as someone whose life matters as much as anyone's. No one should include the very cognitively disabled, as well as others who are inevitably dependent. So Jonas has told us a lot about why the cognitively disabled do not fit into contract theory. So let's step back a bit and point out that to be a contractarian, one needs to be rational, fully dependent, and fully functioning, who can engage in reciprocal social cooperation. But this is not so for very significantly cognitively disabled, yet many fall into this category. Infants, children, frail elderly who are losing their abilities, and all of us at some point in our lives when we are dependent because of illness, temporary or newly acquired disability. Perhaps here we found a new starting point, human dependency and the need for care, something we all share insofar as we are all some mother's child, that is, that someone who would not survive much less thrive if there was not some nurturing person who provided that care. It can be a starting point, however, only if it somehow addresses the point of having a political theory, a theory of justice. So what's the point of political theory? Again, of a theory of justice. And again, Jones has done an excellent job of this. Rawls offers fair terms of cooperation. I want to cast doubt not on the fair terms part, but on the social cooperation. The social arrangements of a democratic society should, I think, talk about the fair terms of the way we live together, given the social arrangements in a democracy of fair and equal people. The idea of social cooperation, the reciprocal sharing of benefits and burdens of social cooperation, fails to take into account the fate of dependence and the care of dependence. A theory of justice more faithful to the intuitive idea of a democratic social ethos would aim for principles of justice that provide fair terms of living together, given our inevitable dependency and our inextricable interdependency. Such principles would ensure that no one is less well off than anyone needs to be because of one's condition of inevitable human dependency, or because one cares for dependence. Such principles would include not only those who are presumably independent, rational agents, as those whose lives matter as much as any, but would really treat everyone as someone whose life matters as much as anyone else. So is there a theory of justice that can accommodate this? In another work, I've spoken of the idea of dulia. Dulia is the principle that society as a whole needs to support the provisioning that enables the caregiver to care for dependents, and to do so in a way that also does not neglect the interests and well-being of the caregiver and promotes care as an ethical ideal. The obligation that finds expression in dulia is a form of reciprocity. Each of us who has survived adulthood has been the beneficiary of care provided not only by a mothering person, but by those who share in all the efforts that make care possible. We owe a debt that is paid back, but it's paid to subsequent generations. A parent is not asks less that the child repay the care it gave to the parent as much as she expects that the reciprocity then extends to the care of the child's child. Therefore, we should not be thinking of care and justice, I want to say, as two competing virtues. Instead, I propose that we view justice, as political philosophers such as Rawls have viewed it, as the first virtue of political philosophy. And that virtue applies to the basic institutions of the society, while an ethic of care is the ethical ideals that governs the interpersonal relations. Then we ask, what sort of principles would we want to govern our basic institutions so that we could realize the ethical ideals put forward in an ethics of care? And when I speak here of ethical ideals, I'm thinking about an ethics of care not as descriptive, but as that is descriptive of how we currently engage in practices of care, but in a normative ideal embedded, but of the normative ideal embedded in these practices. A carer moving through the motions of caring for someone is not embodying the ethical ideal of care, but is doing some sort of, let's say, custodial work, not care. It should be noted that in the long history of moral thought, care is treated neither as a virtue nor as a basis for right action. As men did not traditionally care for children or the ill, the conduct of those activities lacked the systematic moral scrutiny that promises contracts, obligations of a voluntary sort or an involuntary sort, or behavior in battle or business have received. And traditional theories of justice have not included the work or the value of care. Yet we create societies and we make political arrangements for governance precisely because these are the sorts of beings that have extended periods of dependency, which begin in or even before infancy, and which recur not infrequently throughout our lives, especially at the end. When based on these considerations of care, the question of justice is transformed. We ask, given the interdependencies and our mutual dependence, what principles provide fair terms that should govern the basic social and political institutions if we are to live together, work together, and care about each other? What institutions do we require to support each other and to enable each one to flourish given the different capacities and our different relationships to dependency and care? What are the concepts and governing principles for establishing and maintaining such institutions? So I want to consider a number of concepts that are recurrent in political theory and think about how they would get reconceived if we take care as central in this fashion. So Rawls starts his theory of justice with the circumstances of justice, and so shall we. The objective circumstances of justice, in the sense we are developing, however, are the conditions of inevitable human dependency and interdependency that we've discussed. This contrasts with Rawls, who follows Hume in understanding the objective principles of justice as conditions of moderate scarcity. Yet the kinds of concerns that we're talking about here aren't dependent on questions of moderate scarcity. They don't adjudicate moderate scarcity because you can see this when we think about an infant living in the midst of plenty, still needs someone to procure those goods if she is not to starve, if she's to survive. A person with significant impairments may still be disadvantaged, even in the midst of plenty, if she cannot access the goods she requires for her well-being. Turning to subjective circumstances, for Rawls, the subjective circumstances are psychological facts about human beings that each one seeks to realize his conception of the good. This subjective circumstance is circumscribed by the notion of the self as an independent center of activity. But in a conception of justice that's focused on care, the primary constituents of a society are not simply individuals with their own interests, but individuals who exist in varying relations of inevitable dependency and inextricable interdependency. Yet at the same time, it recognizes individuals as connected. It still needs to recognize the interests of each individual as such. The notion of equality is central to theories of democratic theory. And we would want to locate the moral equality, not in a set of necessary and sufficient intrinsic properties, such as our rationality or our autonomy, properties that may not be possessed by people when they're in a condition of inevitable dependency. Instead, in previous work, I've suggested that a relational understanding of equality in which we are each seen as some mother's child, as someone in whom care has been invested, as none of us could survive, much less thrive, without such care. We could use this aphorism or any other, but what we are maintaining is the moral parity that is in the ideal of equality. Rights and responsibilities. With a justice based on a deontological theory such as Kant's, rights can only be constrained by other rights. But in a theory of justice focused on a care ethic, responsibilities and rights, with their correlate duties, are mutually constraining. Rights do not always trump responsibilities, nor do responsibilities always trump rights. Consider, for instance, a caregiver who finds herself needing to stay behind her scheduled time because of a medical appointment of her charge that goes longer than expected. As a worker, she has a right to leave at her appointed hour. Here, however, her responsibilities trump her right. But she also has a right to demand that such overtime be well compensated. And this right would trump responsibilities, they might trump responsibilities that an agency has to use its funds for the primary benefit of its clients. A resolution to a conflict between a right and a responsibility would have to be settled in a contextual way that also represents the principles of justice, as we'll talk about them. Furthermore, the domain of social life governed by principles of justice would now be seen, now in an ethic of care, would now take the realm of care as a central focus of political life and not as an add-on. Freedoms and the satisfaction of needs. Freedom here is the freedom to engage in desired and desirable relationships, as well as the freedom to be left alone. Freedom is also understood as possible only when important needs are satisfied. We're no freer if we are hungry because we're unable to feed ourselves when left to our own devices, than if our hunger results from someone preventing us from eating. Therefore, legitimate needs issue not only in rights, but in a social responsibility to ensure that such rights be met. Asymmetry of power and the problem of domination. This is a problem in the case of questions of dependency. The ideal of democratic theories is that we are all equally situated and equally empowered. But relations that we need when we are in inevitable dependency are not those between those who are equally situated and empowered, even in ideal situations. We need a theory of justice that recognizes that some power inequalities are inevitable and will establish means by which to ensure that the vulnerable are free from domination, abuse, exploitation, and neglect. And these protections become as essential as the need to protect the rights of individuals. The social contract that we've been talking about does important work in political theory, as Jonas has pointed out. It provides a framework for what constitutes legitimate coercive state power, and it gives dignity to each contracting party. But is there a political concept that can serve the same end even when the constituents are not equally situated or empowered and not necessarily capable of autonomous action? I suggest that there's a related notion of the covenant. The covenant, as a religious term, differs from a contract insofar as all parties must take an oath to some power outside to seal that covenant. But the way I wish to understand it is an acknowledgement of a relationship or an agreement that already exists and that binds the constituents to something larger than the parties of the agreement. Therefore, we accept responsibilities or submit to conditions entailed in being in that relationship goes beyond the individual interests of the parties in the agreement. For example, when we purchase land that is covered by a covenant, and we accept the responsibilities and constraints that come with that land. While it's true that the purchase is a contract between buyer and seller, it is the land, not the seller, that is violated if the covenant is not respected. Or consider the duties of a parent to a child. These are not a consequence of a contract between a parent and child. The relationship is instead bound by a covenant that parenthood entails and which raise legitimate expectations on the part of society at large as well as the child in particular. A covenant would bind all parties to consider the well-being, the flourishing of all, even those who cannot sit at the table. Principles of justice generally are distributive principles, certainly within the contract tradition. Justice based on an ethic of care, however, would be allocative and has as its primary aim promoting flourishing life regardless of one's condition of dependency or relation to dependency. This aspiration can be thought of as a shared conception of the good, that people care about each other. It leads not only to a distributive principle, not necessarily to a distributive principle, but to a principle of allocation that attends to matters of dependency first. Material deprivation, however, is not the only way that conditions of dependency can impede the possibility of a flourishing life. Abuse, neglect, exclusion are wrongs that a person in condition of dependency is often powerless against. Without institutional supports, the possibility of a flourishing life are greatly diminished. And so I propose basically three principles. The first is a principle of non-discrimination. The guiding conception of the good yields both responsibilities on the part of social institutions to assure that conditions of dependency do not become conditions of deprivation, as they do in societies where the poorest 25% of the population are children and the disabled are considerably poorer and more poorly represented in employment and invaluable positions in public life. And the right of people to access what they require to have flourishing lives, no matter what their relationship to dependency may be. This principle would demand that public resources and opportunities be distributed in such a way that meeting dependency needs receives prima facie priority over others. And one can well imagine the policies that would follow from that, but I will skip that. The second principle has two parts. It's principle of non-exploitation. First, for dependency workers, let's just say carers and assistants. The second principle is needed to protect those who tend to others in a condition of inevitable dependency from exploitation, as well as the deprivation of resources and opportunities, and include the provision that the labor of caring for dependents must never be coerced, must be fully compensated, and must not close off other opportunities for those who assume such responsibilities. Exploitation is rampant in dependency work. First, there's a hierarchical status that aligns with the assignment of care work. And secondly, one becomes vulnerable in giving care because of one's own attachments and the fact that one might feel oneself indispensable to another's well-being. For dependents, the second part also includes the question of opportunities for inclusion and participation. Dependency leaves the dependent vulnerable to exploitation as well. If someone hands us a lifeline in the form of care, especially if we develop bonds of affection toward that person, then we risk being exploited in order to have our needs and wants met. A principle is needed to protect against such abuse that provides for the institutional protections and resources to opportunities that can help assure people in states of dependency are not left exposed to abuse, exploitation, and have the greatest freedom commensurate with that of others to develop their capacities. The third principle is support for sustaining effective and non-exploitative caring bonds. Liberal theory takes the individual as the prime the prime element of a social order, but it neglects the bonds that form in relations of dependency. And we need to recognize those bonds. So I would suggest a principle that supports and protects these bonds. This principle would assure protections and resources that enable the caring bonds to be sustained without becoming exploitative or abusive. And then there's a last overarching principle that I would suggest, and I call it an enhanced principle of dulia. I've already spoken of dulia as a form of reciprocity. We're obliged to give care to those who need it to the extent that we are able and in a position to do so. And when we are in need, we are owed that care by someone who is well positioned to give it and who will be appropriately compensated and cared for when they need care. I add now an obligation on the part of the one receiving care. One is, I think, obliged to respond to care graciously to the extent one is able when care is offered thoughtfully and in good faith and with requisite competence. And by the gracious reception of care, I don't mean gratitude. I mean being willing to acknowledge the care and not to demand more of the one giving care than that individual can give without depleting herself. Such caregiving is respectful of the carer and the cared for alike. And I add this obligation. This seems more like a virtue of a particular individual relations. But I add it here because it points to the importance of uptake, the uptake of care. And that becomes important when we're thinking about institutions that give care. Because if you're going to really give care, then you need to have uptake by those who receive the care. That means that it's a protection against pernicious paternalism. It's not just what you think the other needs, but it's the way in which the other takes up those needs. And if they don't, then you're probably not giving care, you're doing something else. I've maintained that the principle of dulia, principles of non-exploitation, non-deprivation or neglect, and support for caregiving bonds amounts to this, that the fair, I'm sorry, I don't have that slide, that the it amounts to this, that the fair terms of social life, given our inevitable dependency and our inextricable interdependency, are meant to ensure, first, that when one is in a condition of dependency, whether as a dependent or as a dependency worker, the dependency does not blight our prospects for a good life. And second, that the condition of dependency, when fairly dealt with, will leave no one less well off than they need to be. I'll stop there because I'm probably going beyond my time.
Thank you so much, Eva. It's so interesting. So we are actually doing well on time. Thank you. So we'll move on to Jennifer, Professor Jennifer Nedelsky's presentation, and at the end there will be some time for questions and discussion. Thank you.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay? Yes, okay. So I very much appreciated these two previous presentations. They're both very different from mine, but very connected. I think it's extremely important to hear arguments like Jonas's, so that we understand the way in which our conceptual framework, which dominates so much of one's thinking, not just in philosophy, but law, economics, of a contractual notion, it has built in inequalities and discrimination. And we need the kind of unpacking he did for us to be able to see that. And then Eva Kittay offers us alternative conceptual frameworks so that we can start building new ways of thinking about these things. Now, the book that I'm working on now, it's a co-authored book with a political economist, Tom Mallison, is really not driven by a theory of justice. I don't start with a theory of justice and then apply it. I start with a set of problems in society and try to think about how to solve them. But those solutions are driven by a commitment to equality, which is quite similar to the kind of equality that Eva Kittay lays out, and also driven by a notion of the fundamental interdependence of human beings. But one of the things I hope you will all listen to as I present this is that part of the claim here is that were we successful in trying to get these new norms adopted, they would provide a framework in which everyone would learn through experience about this fundamental interdependence that we have with one another and become experientially educated about the kind of notions of equality and justice that we need. So I'll start with saying that we think that there are three critical problems that confront contemporary societies. These that we think we have a solution to: unsustainable stress on families, persistent inequality for women and others who do care work, and policymakers who are ignorant about the care that life requires. These problems arise out of destructive norms around work and care. By norms, we mean the widespread expectations of how competent adult men and women should contribute to society and fulfill their responsibilities to each other. So this book is about the transformation of norms. It's about rethinking by talking to one another about how we want to work, how we want to care, in short, really how we want to live with one another. And it's important that we think that what's needed to solve these big problems are not small changes like better access to flexible work hours or even better publicly supported childcare, but a fundamental change that can actually address these problems. The book presents a proposal, part-time for all, for reshaping the existing conversations about work-family balance. There's a lot of that talk out there, a lot of stuff in newspapers, most of which is fairly superficial. The proposal is that all capable adults are expected to do paid work part-time, no less than 12 and no more than 30 hours a week, and to do unpaid care part-time, a minimum of 22 hours a week. And our hope is that this proposal will spark an urgently needed conversation that will radically change existing beliefs and practices around both work and care. Solving the problems of family stress, inequality, and the ignorance of policy makers makes this urgent. Serious harm is caused by the constant stress of being overwhelmed with the demands of providing, both emotionally and financially, for families while meeting the demands of work. The work demands can take the form of looking for work or of holding and commuting between multiple precarious, insecure jobs, or of working the 60, 70-hour weeks of many high-end jobs. And even in middle income jobs, people often feel they must work extra long hours to prove that they are valuable employees in the face of daily anxiety about how long their jobs will last. In addition, it's harmful to everyone to live in a society where the care of children, the elderly, and the disabled is treated as obviously of little value. It is done by those whose time is seen as least valuable, and it is rewarded with little respect, and when paid at all, with low pay and often very bad working conditions. Everyone suffers when policy, and not just around work and care, but around education, health, housing, or taxation, is made by those who are ignorant of the significance of care for the quality of life and the relationships that make it meaningful. So one of the underlying puzzles of part-time for all is that what it's going to take to get a revaluing of care and why we need this. The puzzle is that at some level, everybody has to know how essential care is. And yet we live in a society that simply does not manifest that kind of a recognition. We look down on care and on those who do it. So in the book, we present 4 interlocking failures of the existing system of work and care. The first is the pervasive failure to recognize the real value of care. And the second is tying care to inequality. When a society denigrates care and has categories of hierarchy around which advantages are distributed, like gender, race, class, and so on, then care will be relegated to those who are low down in that hierarchy. The denigration of care and of those who do it becomes mutually reinforcing, making both seem natural. So your colleague at McGill, Adele Blackett, has done a fantastic job of spelling this out in detail, how this works in the context of race and domestic work. Hierarchies of inequality are further cemented and perversely tied to what should be a core value, care. In such a context, the third problem, what we call the care policy divide, arises. So what you have is some groups, historically white men, are the decision makers, and different groups, women, racialized people, and immigrants, provide the care, resulting in high status, ignorant policymakers and subordinated caregivers excluded from high-level decision-making. The fourth interlocking point is that in contemporary high-income societies, we face the pressing problems, as I mentioned, of stressed families, as well as stressed workplaces, due to the unsustainable demands of both work and care, which then ill-informed policymakers fail to respond to. Now, some of these problems are very long-standing, the organization of care around hierarchy, and some are more recent, like the particular issues arising out of large numbers of women in the workplace, without basic modifications of either the provision of care or the demands of work. A real solution must address all of the core problems: societal devaluation of care, inequality for those who do care, the care policy divide, and the unsustainable stress on families. There are lots of solutions out there, which I'll mention briefly later, like wages for housework, which might solve one of those problems, like the stress in the family, a little bit on the inequality, but nothing on the care policy divide. We think that the heart of the solution must be that everyone is responsible for providing care, regardless of how important their work is. A society committed to equality, to respect for care, to competent policymakers, and to thriving families cannot assign care to only a subset of the population. And even if we change who that subset is, so for example, not just women, but racialized and immigrant men and women who do care, as long as only a subset of the population does care, both care and those who do it will be denigrated, and policymakers will continue to be ignorant. An equal, well-governed society requires a population, all of whom know about care from the experience of doing it. So on this model, everyone is a care provider, just as everyone is a care receiver, and everyone identifies as both. Everyone acquires the skills, disposition, and knowledge that come from doing sustained caregiving. Everyone builds the relationships that care fosters and sustains. And everyone comes to recognize the care they receive. Some people might think this is self-evident, but there is a lot of evidence that high-income men in particular are actually oblivious to the care they receive. They don't know that they're care recipients. So that there is a kind of blindness to the whole phenomenon of care. Under the conditions that we're thinking of, caregivers are not denigrated because everyone is one. And individually and collectively, everyone recognizes the real value of care. And everyone recognizes the full diversity of capacities to provide care, as well as the huge range of needs for care. Everyone learns what they need to know about care, to assess and to make good policy. To transform a structure of care so that everyone does it will, of course, involve a transformation of the structure of work. I'm struck over and over again, and I invite you to listen to the comment on COVID. Everybody is alert to the realities of care now, temporarily, and of the injustices and inequalities, but I almost never hear a comment on how you cannot fix these deeply embedded problems without changing the structure of work. That's not on the table. So we think you can't do it. You can't fix care without transforming the structure of work. If everyone's going to have time to provide care, most people are going to have to do less paid work. Work has to be restructured so that good part-time work would be the norm. Everyone becomes a part-time paid worker and a part-time unpaid caregiver. This would, of course, involve a huge cultural shift affecting the economy, people's sense of identity, and the way care is connected to family, to the state, and to the market. So we have a proposal for new norms of both work and care that we think can accomplish this. I should say that most of the book is about human-to-human care, which is what the first two papers were also about. But I have included a section on care for the earth as part of our fundamental care obligations, but I won't be saying much about that today. So first of all, I want to remind you that we're talking about norms, socially sanctioned norms, not state-enforced laws, although there will be some supporting state law and policy that will ultimately be necessary, like protecting part-time work. What we hope for is widespread, small and large-scale discussions so that these crucial norms are subject to many layers of informal but ongoing democratic deliberation. Our objective is to challenge the inevitability of existing norms and invite people to imagine how they would really like to live. So as I said, the proposal is that all capable pre-retirement adults are expected to do paid work part-time, no less than 12, no more than 30 hours a week. And paid work would continue to be a way that people contribute to society, and it would be part of a respected value. But work would become just one among other sources of identity and contribution. Everyone would also do unpaid care, 22 hours a week at a minimum, which, by the way, includes the care for oneself. So really 22 hours a week is not very demanding when you think about the time that it takes to actually care for yourself, as opposed to pay somebody else to do it or get somebody to do it through unpaid care. The proposed hours are there to serve as guidelines as people get used to the new norms, primarily for self-regulation and sometimes for the communities of care, which I'll come to in a moment. When the demands of friends and family are high, so children are young, parents are aging, there's somebody sick in your immediate circle, most of this care would be provided within these intimate circles, most of this 22 hours a week. But the care responsibility is constant. It doesn't follow the arc of an individual life, intense when your kids are young or your parents are elderly, and much less in between. When these immediate needs recede, people would provide care within their chosen communities of care. They would form serious commitments to mutual care among people they know and care about, such as neighbors or faith communities, choirs, sports groups. People are not caring for strangers, but the communities of care are not primarily family or close friends. Thus, care responsibilities extend beyond family, and the solution to denigration and inequality is not paying for the care, like wages for housework, but everyone offering unpaid, personally connected care. The objective is to recognize the forms of interconnection possible within the vast diversity of human talents, temperaments, and needs, and to encourage everyone to participate in ways suited to their particular needs and capacities. Of course, this proposal assumes that virtually everyone has the capacity to learn to contribute good care. We address this in detail in the book, what one needs to learn about doing care, how one learns from doing care, what one learns from doing care. Here, I just want to note a few of the points. First, we're not talking about replacing professional care with unpaid care. But there are some skills currently associated with professionals, such as giving injections or safely transferring someone into a wheelchair, that can fairly be easily learned by non-professionals. Many people will, however, continue to require care from professionals in both their homes and in formal care facilities. The unpaid care everyone contributes is meant to supplement, not replace, professional care. For example, even if there's a visiting nurse after a person returns home from an operation, someone else still needs to do the shopping, cooking, cleaning, and emotional support. Second, we recognize that the existing care failures, which are so characteristic of all the well-off societies we're thinking about, many vulnerable people have a lot of fear around incompetent care, given those deficiencies. And even though most of the bad experiences are with paid care, the idea of untrained neighbors being expected to provide them with the care they need looks frightening. We hope these fears can be allayed when it is clear that professional care would continue to be available and better publicly supported as everyone understands the value of care under these new norms and experience, and training for non-professionals would become more common. In addition, there would be strong norms of attending to the preferences of care recipients, the kinds of things that Eva was referring to at the end of her talk. We expect people to see that there are many forms of care that can be safely and competently provided by members of one's community, sometimes with formal training, always with guidance on listening carefully to care recipients. We also have a discussion of the norms for recipients, and I was happy to see that Eva used the phrase graceful, that because gracious and graceful, those are the terms I talk about of we all need to learn those skills. There are skills in providing care and there are skills in receiving care, and under the hierarchical arrangements we have, most people don't learn either of those skills. The range of needs that actually needs doing runs from errands to telling stories to children visiting an isolated elder to more intimate things like helping somebody eat. We believe that virtually everyone, including those who identify as having disabilities, has the ability to learn to be very good at some part of the care required in their community. So we think that these fears for the vulnerable and the more general concern about whether we are unreasonably assuming competence should be allayed by thinking about the norms and policies about becoming parents. I'm going to skip some of the details there, but I just want to remind you that neither formal accreditation nor payment is the basis for care that is delivered around the world. So mutual care within communities would, among its other benefits, disrupt the deep patterns of people with lower status providing care for those with more privilege by gender, race, class, income, ethnicity, or immigration status. Of course, there would still be a variety of challenges of continuing inequalities, oversight, training, and meeting the needs of the hard to serve. But we will argue that there is good reason to believe that in the presence of strong norms of equality and of contribution, the diversity of capacities can be matched with a great range of needs. We expect the quality of care for most people will improve under these new norms. Now, I just want to say briefly that we definitely think this is not a utopia. This is immediately feasible. It's my colleague Tom's job in his 2 chapters to explain why this is economically feasible right now under global capitalism. It won't solve all the problems of injustice, but then again, we don't have to wait for all of those problems or for a full economic revolution to take place in order to make huge changes in the quality of care available to everyone. And we remind people in the book that there are many examples of norm change out there, deep norm change. Some of the ones we think about are the changes that arose from the second wave of feminism, changes around drinking and driving, smoking, same-sex relationships. And each of these reveal the complex and sometimes different interrelations between whether state policy initiates the changes, usually not, but it can foster changes once they have started, like with the daddy days parental leave in the Nordic countries. So in the interest of time, I'm going to just mention 2 of the other benefits. One of them is time, that we expect that the chronic time scarcity that affects people across the income spectrum will be radically reduced, and that this will have a major change in people's lives and their capacities to be generous, their capacities to be open and receptive and reflective. Another important change is around the norms around masculinity. Of course, the idea that everyone cares and that men and women care equally is a big challenge to dominant notions around masculinity. But one of the really interesting benefits is that there's evidence coming in from around the world that when men participate actively in the care for their very young children, they are much less likely to be violent later on. So that this radical involvement of men in the care of young children may have the additional benefit of finally changing longstanding norms around masculinity and violence. So now I want to just talk a little bit about some of the objections to this proposal. And the most powerful and common objection is some variant of the idea that these norms are too restrictive and intrusive. That asking everyone to care and everyone to limit their work, regardless of their preference, talents, inclination, is too big an incursion on their preferences or their freedom or their autonomy. And one thing we try to note over and over again is that when norms change, people tend to perceive the change as a sudden intrusion. So one clear example is the changing norms around intimate partner violence, which was clearly and still is perceived to be an intrusion into family life. And of course, it is a restriction on behavior, but it's a restriction in the name of equality and protection. in some ways more minor way, there are people who still see the new norms around what you can say publicly in terms of racist and sexist jokes as an intrusion, political correctness that unduly constrains their preference. This is a common phenomenon. And it's not to say that there wouldn't be significant new ways people's beliefs and actions will be directed under these new norms. It is to claim that there will not be an increase in the way norms shape their choices around care and work. There will be different norms, new norms, which we think will ultimately be freeing for far more people. Okay. I want to highlight one form. So we have a whole section in here about what one learns from care. And I want to highlight just one form of that understanding that comes from the practice of care, which now everyone would have. And that is an understanding of how care builds relationships, how relationships require care, how a lack of care, attention, and availability can harm relationships. Our claim is that a widely shared understanding of the linked centrality of relationship and care is essential to individual and collective well-being. A society where large numbers of people do not have a deep understanding of why and how care matters will make poor choices about how to design their institutions, how to use their time and resources, and about what norms and practices to support, foster, and facilitate. This collective failure is exacerbated when those who make high-level policy decisions affecting the lives of others are especially ignorant due to their very limited experience of care. Deborah Stone, in her book about Good Samaritans, reminds us that this ignorance of care and relationship is often dressed up in the rhetoric of the rational, self-interested actor, which is the dominant language of so much of contemporary economics, law, and politics. The knowledge we believe people can acquire through care can start to cut through this dominant frame of analysis. And we also discussed the links to the capacity for empathy and for taking the perspectives of others. And these in turn are vital to the exercise of good judgment, so essential in a democracy. So I have a final section, which I'm just gonna note very briefly. Another form of the objection to this is that its intrusiveness into intimate domains, how people organize the domestic distribution of work in their own households, the demand that everybody participate, comes to have a kind of authoritarian tone to it. One of my U of T colleagues referred to it as Maoist re-education. And again, I think this is really not at all what we're aiming at, and I don't see any reason why it would take that form. The new norms would be no more constraining than the current highly gendered and racialized norms around who does what kind of work and care. In many respects, we expect people's choices about how to live to expand and not contract as paid work loses its dominant roles in people's lives, and time for community participation and leisure, as well as care, increases. Then finally, though I'm not going to have time really to go into it, people also, sometimes philosophers, but sometimes just ordinary people, worry that this kind of normative framework has built into it a set of values that would be imposed on everyone in a way that is unacceptable in a liberal society. And so we have a set of arguments about why this is not true. It is, of course, an argument about equality and what equality requires. And like many arguments about what equality requires, those will be contested. But equality itself, after all, is not in principle a contested value, although its actual content is, in any of the societies we're looking at. And we think that part of what's going on here in this resistance to the perception that this is somehow a kind of imposition which distinguishes it from other sorts of social norms that guide and shape people's beliefs and values, is in part a resistance to the idea that liberal societies, particularly those in the Anglo world, actually are going to have to change their core behavior in order to make equality real. That people have held on to a notion that no deep change in their identities or intimate behavior is going to be necessary to actually accomplish equality. And this, I think, is increasingly recognized not to be not true. I think that's part of the message of Black Lives Matters and of Indigenous rights arguments within Canada, that we have to understand that values, norms, and behaviors are really going to have to change if we're going to make good on our deep commitments to equality. So in conclusion, we do not think that part-time for all would impose values on people in ways that are fundamentally different from the ways all social organization reinforces certain values over others. We think the shorter work hours, together with economic security, which we stipulate as necessary, and the flourishing of multiple care-based connections would allow a much greater diversity of family formations, modes of work, play, and activism, and general freedom about how to live. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you so much. Professor Nedelsky and Professor Kittay, for those very interesting analysis and proposals. And so we'll use the remaining 30 minutes we have for questions and discussions from the audience, or if one of the speakers has a question for the other, that's also allowed. And the way we will proceed is either you can in the chat write your question, and then I may repeat it to the speaker to whom you address it, or you can raise your hand with the logo and the reaction logo, so that we can unmute you then, so that you may ask the question. And okay, and so so Eva Kittay will be starting off, and then we'll have
Thank you, Jenny. And thank you, Jonas. You know how I value your work, Jonas. Jenny, you're starting to bring me around, but I want to ask you why you don't. I mean, I entirely believe that the structure of work needs to change. This is crucial, and it really shows how even if we change the gender divide, what happens is that women move over to the male side of the divide, men rarely move over to the woman's side of the divide, and this is reflected in the inability of organizations and businesses and policies that have to do with work. But I want to ask you why you rule out, for example, or perhaps you don't, the idea of people doing care at some point in their life for full-time, and then return to a larger commitment to work outside of caregiving. It seems to me that I entirely agree that because men have not done care work, the policies that we have reflect that ignorance of what care is and the value of care, and we certainly see it in philosophy. But why can't we expect that men who engage in care for part of their life acquire many of those capabilities, and that they then bring into their work life, and that, or if they're in government, that they then bring into policies. I think it's telling that our new president, the US new president, has done care work in his earlier life. And he does talk about caring, which is very rare to hear amongst politicians. But it doesn't necessarily mean that he has to divide up his everyday caring. And yeah.
So there are two answers to that. One is, I think it's really important to remember that 22 hours a week is not a lot. So even if it's just taking responsibility for the care of yourself, it would come, I don't know what it would be. It would be at least 15 hours a week, probably more. So I don't think of this as a huge imposition in people's lives to say everybody throughout their life, as long as they're able, devotes consistently something like 22 hours a week. So, but why? And the part of the argument is that this is not just an acquisition of skills. It's an acquisition of a disposition, of a character. And, I think all of your own attentiveness to what it takes to be a good caregiver actually speaks to those qualities that are not about skill acquisition, but about character, really. And I don't think that just doing it for, the years when your children are under 7 or something is going to be sufficient to sustain this throughout your life. That's one point. The second point is that if we build this in, what's going to happen is, first of all, it'll be gendered, right? More men will move back into the work world and be surrounded by other men who've moved back into the work world and now have very little contact with care. And the norms of that world will start to re-establish themselves. So one of the things I skipped was saying that how I think our experience of time will change, that the clock life of the work world will no longer dominate everything. And I think it actually is part of why people think of care as kind of drudgery and repetitious, is because there's a particular framework of productivity and its relationship to time that comes out of the, quote, productive work world. And so if you cannot sustain this deep transformation of your relationship to time, of your relationship to attunement to others, by just having it for a little bit of your life and then reinserting yourself into a milieu where you're surrounded by people who no longer have that experience. And the hierarchy of work over care will also reestablish itself. And that is one of the central projects here, is shifting that hierarchy. And if it starts being, a little excursion for men disproportionately when their kids are young, and then they're going to revert back to this other world, it's not that isn't better than nothing, but it's not anywhere near as good for the wholesale transformation in the whole culture's perception about care and all that goes with it, as would happen if everybody did it throughout their lives.
Okay, thank you. So we have a few questions lined up, so I'll go in order, starting with Chloe Atkins, who I will try to unmute. Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, I did. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So I, like Eva, Jenny, you're bringing me around. So because originally I think it's brilliant and I think it's fascinating, but as someone with a disability, I had some real fears, and I think you're beginning to answer some of them. And so I'm feeling, sort of more warm to it. And I also think, given that you also have a portion which you didn't address, which is around care for the earth, that if you have individuals who simply are sort of more attuned to things rather than people, that their care provision could in fact be focused more in that way, and therefore not be imposed on people who need a different form of care or interaction. So that sort of is some help. So I mean, as I said, you're bringing me around, and one of the thoughts I had is I'm doing some work right now, and I've just got a grant in which we're going to do some podcasts with people with disabilities. And one of my thoughts is I'm trying to sort of get the able population to be more aware of what disabled life is like and how capable and interesting people are who they may perceive as not being capable. And what I realize is with your model, because you have care provision, then the populace will have more and increasing interactions with people of different abilities and different capacities. And so that maybe, in fact, that integration and that awareness of people might be helpful, rather than the fear that I worried about of having sort of kerosene as an imposition that's being, and then, we're just sort of the ones being shuffled around, being cared for. But one of the thoughts I had, what I worry about is then, then care in itself becomes a value, which is good. But if you are so disabled, and one of the things that I think you might emphasize, and I know it's there, but you didn't talk about it this time, is the reciprocity. Because one of the things I've learned is I've had the brilliance of having a disease that renders me very vulnerable, total quad and vent dependent, to being able to pass, sort of like this. But when I was a quad, and I had young children, Children's Aid was actually called on us because I was perceived by someone, a neighbor, as being incapable of looking after those children. And there wasn't a recognition that I was actually capable, even though I required care in certain other ways, that I was capable of providing care towards others. So that, I sort of, as I sort of grew along with my disability, I began to realize that they're just invisible disabilities and more apparent ones. And some of them, my spouse has sort of inabilities that I cover for, and my spouse covers for inabilities of mine. And so that's sort of the nature of the dance of humanity. But there are individuals, for instance, I don't know Eva Kittay's daughter, but I suspect there are not obvious things that she's not going to read aloud to a child at night. They're not sort of caregiving provisions that she may undertake, right? And so what I worry is that there is then still going to be this lower class of people who are seen as being devalued because they cannot be seen as participants in this other than as recipients. And that, I think, is just a bit of a worry in me about what happens to those individuals. And Eva, I can see I've left to say, I'll mute now.
Okay, so first, I think it's one of the things that I didn't talk about at all is the way in which this will require a great deal of new kinds of creativity in how workplaces are structured. So almost every job has to be radically reconfigured. It has to be moved from a full-time job to a part-time job. And so that's the first step. And I'm anticipating that what will happen is that a great deal more creativity about envisioning all the different pieces of jobs and the different ways different people with different kinds of capacities can fulfill the different pieces of these productive projects. Whereas we have, a very limited set of ideas about what it means to have a job and who can have one and so on. So I would expect that creativity to spill over to many, many people who have disabilities. And there would be much more scope for their roles in the workplace. And therefore, everyone would have much more experience with working with the range of capacities. And the same thing, this goes back to Eva's question, why does it matter so much that everybody do it? Everybody is a member of a care community. And, given the range of disabilities that are out there, whether temporary when you break your leg or long-term or intermittent, everyone will have a much greater likelihood of knowing about the people in their communities who have disabilities and learning how to help care for them in non-professional ways, so that the reciprocity will be built in both the workplace and in communities. Now, the point about who among people with disabilities is going to be further stigmatized as also being seen as not able to care. And there, I think we just have to also think about creativity. So Eva mentioned that her daughter really loves music. Maybe she can play musical instruments, you know, like drums and cymbals with other young children. You know what, I don't know, but the people, and that's part of the problem, is most people don't know. They don't know what are the range of possibilities of human interaction that would be caring, and therefore play a role in a community of care.
Okay, thank you. So I'm aware, Mariana, Nora, you have a question. So please just leave your hands up for a moment. So I just want to, because I'm aware of time, I will ask two of the questions in a row, so that either of you can address it. There was one question that thought that the point of receiving care is also a skill. And this Melanie Coughlin, this participant, was curious about how can we universally develop this skill further within either of your thought system. And another question had to do with a very different question, had to do with artificial intelligence. And that participant was curious to know your thoughts about broader incoming changes to the structure of work with increased automation and innovations in artificial intelligence, and how those will fit into a model of increased mutual care and less emphasis on paid work outside of the home. And so those are two very different questions that you can deal in one time, and then we'll move to the other questions, as we'll take as much as we can, as many as we can.
So I can answer just really quickly the thing about artificial intelligence. So I really welcome this because I think not on the care side, but on the work side, we can anticipate about 40% of existing jobs disappearing. And instead of being all in despair about how we're going to create, you know, all those new full-time jobs, we just don't, right? We respond to this transformation with these new norms by creating excellent part-time jobs. So, and I just say before that we have a section in the book, and we envision that this is one of the things communities of care will do, is help develop new norms of how one receives care well and respectfully.
So I'd like to address that second point first. My daughter taught me about the reception of care. I didn't see what the reception of care had to do with care at all. Joan Toronto and talks about reception of care as the final. The NL Noddings talks about the need to complete care in the other. And it took me a while to understand that she was not just passive, but that she was actually accepting my care. And the way I understood that was in contrast to my aging mother, who was unable to accept my care. And I saw the difference. So she was active in that. She actually taught me this. But I mean, there will be people who, for whom, I mean, you can talk about creativity in, you know, what constitutes work, but I think in some ways it's a little hokey with some people with certain kinds of disabilities. I think for most people with disabilities, they can work. Most people with disabilities can do caring. But there are some who really can't do either because they just can't do things. And I think that would just have to be recognized. I don't think, you know, you can certainly try to engage, you know, a person in caregiving. I know my daughter, she loves little children, but there's nothing she can do for them, and there's nothing she can do with them unless they engage with her. So Um, a little bit of caution there. As far as artificial intelligence goes, I am actually taken by the possibility. I've never thought I would be, but that there can be forms of AI that are care, not care in the sense of the ideal that fits into an ethics of care, but that can meet needs that are more difficult for another human being to meet because it's more difficult for the person who receives the care to really take that care from another human being. So I think we shouldn't throw that out entirely. And from the position of work, I totally agree with you.
Okay, thank you so much. Again, in the in the interest of time, we'll keep both the questions and the answers short, so that we at least can answer the two questions that we have. So first, Mariana, feel free to unmute. Yes, feel free to. Sorry, no, Nora was first. Feel free to unmute yourself. Oh, it's an accident. You did not.
No, Mariana was first.
Okay, then please. Sorry about this. Please.
No worries. Thank you so much. So my question is directed for Professor Nedelsky. My question is, keeping in mind that people who have been delegated to the lowest rungs of social hierarchy have been assigned unvalued care work currently. So in your proposal, if people get to choose the types of care that they're best suited towards or that best fits their temperament, then what would prevent the white upperclassmen from taking less demands of, like, less demanding forms of care or self-care in their minimum 22-hour period, and then leaving more strenuous forms of care to racialized and gendered people, and simply replicating this stratification? In my opinion, I think that pay would be an effective way to avoid this stratification being replicated. So in Angela Davis's Women, Race, and Class, she argues that a critical part of gender liberation is actually making caregiving work a highly paid and highly skilled form of labor. So what do you think about this, and why would you, and what do you think of the trap that these forms of stratification would only be replicated?
Right, thank you. So I'm unmuted, right? Yeah. So first, I think in the paid work context, so when you're a paid carer, I think it's vital that that it become good pay where it's currently bad pay. And I think that is genuinely more likely when everybody actually believes that care matters, that it involves skill. I mean, it's surprising the number of people who think that it's just a low skilled thing, even if they should know, if they had a sick child or a sick parent, how much skill is entailed. But this idea that it's low paid reinforces the idea that it's low skilled, it's even because of our market story we tell ourselves. So I think the pay would shift under these new norms. But the question about the reinsertion of the hierarchy around people's, already built-in predispositions and choices. So first, I would say that in the communities of care, because everybody is both a recipient and a caregiver, I expect there to be a disruption of that hierarchy, right? Which doesn't entirely answer your question, but in the first instance, white middle-class men are going to be caring for various people in their communities. Now, there is a separate question about the potential for insularity of communities, right? So that they're all just caring for other people of their own, just like them. But I think part of this is part of what I envision as being this ongoing deliberatory mode in the communities of care. so that there is an effort to address this, and that there would be objections both within households and within communities when you see an effort to replicate these hierarchies. But there's one particular place where I actually take this up in the book at some length, and have been really surprised at the pushback I have gotten it a few times from professional women of my generation who survived professionally by having paid care help in their household. And here's the part that we say, we do not want one of the hierarchies that currently exists to be reestablished, and that is people use all their care hours for what's sometimes called intimate care, playing with the kids, and then they hire somebody else to clean the house and clean the toilets and all that. And that we want to say the norms should be, you don't do that. Everybody participates in both the material care and the intimate care. You don't use payment as how to handle this. And twice I heard somebody say, oh no, you can't be kidding. That can't possibly be. First of all, who cares who cleans the toilet? How is that an act of care? Which I found a shocking comment. Actually, I have a whole page on this in the book. So I do think there are deep patterns of hierarchy that will need to be resisted. And so we take time to kind of talk about that. So I'll think about that particular issue of, we see it, of course, this has been well documented, the kind of care that men choose to do in the household. We know what that looks like. And so why wouldn't that just be replicated out there? And so I'll actually add in a little section about that. Thank you.
Okay, so for the last question, we unfortunately just have 1 minute for the question and 1 minute for the answer. So please. You have to unmute yourself. No, yeah. Good.
I think it comes as a follow-up to Mariana's question, because I was going to ask, does the proposal have anything on education and what we include in our curriculums for children? We've taken away things like practical house economics and things that are, useful to kind of change those intrinsic patterns. So maybe a word on that, and giving high school students and university students more time, maybe part-time there, for them to be able to contribute. So and thank you so much. I'm enjoying this greatly.
Thank you for that question. So we have only a tiny little reference to the importance of, school curriculum, but what we do talk about, one of the very early presentations I gave on this almost 5 years ago, I think, was at McGill. And there were a lot of law students in the room. Of course, I was physically present in those days. And they said, well, what about legal education? Very, very long hours. And I said, absolutely. We need to really rethink education, and not just making genuine part-time education available to everyone. But the harder thing that I really spent some time thinking about is the way in which speed. Are you a fast reader? So that you can get through your assignments in half the time that somebody else does. And how should, and law school is a place that puts a premium on this kind of speed. What should be done in restructuring the curriculum so that that is just one of the many forms of neurodiversity that we accommodate for, instead of just privileging, well, that just means you're better and you'll be a better, smarter, faster lawyer. So everybody will want you. So there's no reason not to advantage you. So there are we have a section on the way in which excellence, long hours, and speed are this constellation in our worldview that is incredibly destructive and has to be undermined for this to work.
Okay, great. Well, so we are right on time, and I really appreciate it. I had to hold off my own questions about how this reconceptualization of the use of time could get somehow closer to crip time itself, and so other notions that interest me. So, but we'll thank. Well, now we cannot all applaud in person, but I really am thankful for Professor Kittay and Professor Nedelsky to have shared those very, very interesting insights with us. It's a real pleasure to have heard your talks, and I look forward to reading